I think this one's the biggest. Good morning and welcome back to our garden. Today it's 12 weeks before our last freeze, so it means it's time to start some seeds in the basement to put out later into the garden. Today we're going to start 3 types of onions. Plus, let's switch gears to talking about bulbing onions. I want to start them inside 10 to 12 weeks before our last frost. This is perfect. It's 12 weeks right now. And we're going to use the soil blocker and these 10 by 10 bootstrap farmer trays. So I can make 25 blocks fit in here. So we're going to start 3 varieties, and the first is a red, small, 2-inch Italian sweet onion. It's called flat Italian cipollone onion. It is an heirloom, and these are my own saved seeds. That's what's actually out there still in the garden. That's an intermediate day onion, and that means it needs 12 to 14 hours of sunlight in order to bulb up. And we can grow that here in north central Maryland. But this is a fast-growing 70-day onion, and it stores well. I still have some in the kitchen after 6 months. And I'm going to put several seeds in each soil block. Now we have 2 more varieties, and they're both long day onions, and that means they need 14 hours or more a day of sunlight. They grow well in the north, but we can grow them here too. They're both a sweet yellow onion, Walla Walla, and yellow Spanish sweet onion, Utah. Now, the Walla Walla takes about 125 days to mature, but it doesn't store well, so when I harvest them, I'm going to cut them up and freeze them. And the yellow Spanish takes about 130 days to mature, but those store well too, about 6 months, like those red onions. Now, the Walla Walla are 4 to 6 inch, and the sweet Spanish are 3 to 6 inches. Yeah, I had to look at my notes to check that. Both are hybrids, and I don't plan to save the seeds, but I wanted to go ahead and use up the seeds that I had this year. Now they're going to germinate in about 7 to 15 days. I cover all of the seeds I sow with a dome to hold in the moisture. And they're going to go out in the garden in about mid-March. Good morning and welcome back to Withrow Urban Homestead. Today we're going to pot up onions. Now I've already prepared some 4-inch pots. And the soil we're going to use is Pro Mix Organic garden potting soil. I really like that it's been inoculated with microscopic fungus. It helps to inoculate the soil and it helps the root system. Now, we sowed these onion seeds 3 weeks ago. Now, in 2 weeks, we're going to start bringing these outside to get used to the weather, the wind and the sun. It's called hardening them off. It's going to be about 6 weeks before our last frost. You can start hardening them off anywhere between 4 and 6 weeks before your last frost. Here that means at the beginning of March. And 2 weeks after that, we're going to plant them into the garden in a sunny location. And that's going to be 4 weeks before our last freeze. That's going to be mid-March here. Now, the onions are going to stay in these pots 1 month before putting them out into the garden. Now, you could leave them in the soil blocks 1 more month, but I have the pots, the soil, the time, and the space, so I'm going to go ahead and pot them up. I just want to give them more room to grow, but that's really not necessary. Now, whether you leave them in the soil blocks or pot them up, you do want to thin them at about 2 to 3 weeks after you've sown them, and you only want 1 onion plant per block or pot. Now, some people trim the tops of their onions, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to leave them as they are. Now, onions require cool weather to grow the green tops, the green leaves. And the onion need nice big green tops, leaves, to grow a big bulb. Those leaves collect the energy from the sun to make that bulb. And that's the reason I'm not going to trim my tops. So each leaf develops a layer of the onion, the rings. Each leaf is responsible for developing their own layer. So the more leaves you have, the bigger your onions are going to be. An onion tends to have about 8 to 12 leaves, but not all of them are going to survive to maturity. In young onions, 1 or 2 leaves are going to kind of die off. Now, if cool weather helps the leaves grow and develop, what causes them to bulb up? Well, that's based on the light from the sun, how long the day is, how many hours of daylight they're getting. When they hit the required number of hours of daylight, then they start forming those bulbs. So if you're growing long day onions, which require 14 hours of sunlight to start developing bulbs, if you're growing those in the deep south, you're never going to have bulbs. Now in the South, you need to grow what's called short day onions. They only require 12 hours of light to start bulbing up. Then there's intermediate day onions, and they require 12 to 14 hours of sunlight to develop bulbs. Now here in north central Maryland, I can grow both intermediate day and long day onions. I'm growing 3 varieties, 2 long day and 1 intermediate day. These are Walla Walla onions. And less of them germinated, so if I have 2 growing together in one block, I can separate them and pot them up individually. Now, Walla Walla are a sweet, short storage onion. I'm also growing Spanish yellow sweet onions, and those store for 6 months, and a small red Italian flat onion. And it's an heirloom, and it'll also store for about 6 months, and I'm using my own saved seeds. Now, they do best growing leaves at 55 degrees to 65 degrees, but this room tends to run 65 to 75 degrees. So after I get them all potted up, I'm going to move them to the front room of the basement where it's colder. It's going to be the perfect place. Now I'm going to want to make sure I label these onions, because these Walla Walla onions, they're bigger and they're going to require more space than the red flat Italian onions, which is a small onion and requires less space. Plus, those are going to be ready in only 60 days, but the Walla Walla are going to take double the time at 125 days. So I want to make sure I plant them together so that when the little red Italian onions are done, I can harvest them and use that space for something else. Now I've got 1 tray left and several of each variety. So I'm going to get these potted up, then I'm going to show you their new home. They're going to grow in this location inside under the lights for 2 more weeks. Good morning and welcome back to Withrow Urban Homestead. It's time to start hardening off our onions. Onions need to start getting used to the weather, the the wind, sun, and the outside temperature 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost. And here in north central Maryland, it's now 8 weeks before our last frost. So it's time to bring them upstairs and start putting them outside. Now I need to start them in a protected area. So here close to the house on the patio, that's going to be a good place. And we're only going to start by leaving them outside 2 hours today. We just have to build up slowly. And because they're only going to be outside 2 hours, I've set up some lights here in the kitchen, close to the garden. They're going to be outside for 2 hours and then back outside under these lights. Now these onion seedlings are 6 weeks old. And we potted them up only 1 month ago. So they've been in those 4-inch pots for 1 month growing. And every day we're going to increase the time they stay outside. Now the squirrels will dig in these pots, so I need to cover them and protect them. Now, if onions are exposed consistently to temperatures below 45, they're going to send up a flower head called bolting. For that reason, I don't plan to set them outside every day until it's 50 degrees. Now, every day we're going to move them closer and closer to the full sun. Closer to the garden where they'll be less protected. After about a week or two, depending on the weather, we'll plant them out into the garden. So you want to plant them out 4 to 6 weeks before your last frost. And here that'll be 6 weeks, mid-March. If you're like me and you need to protect your seedlings, I don't recommend this brand of netting. It tears really easy. It's not worth the money. There's another brand that I'll link in the description that's better. I think this one that I bought is some kind of generic product, kind of a knockoff. But let me warn you, these nets are not cheap. Now today they're going to stay out for about 2 hours, then go back in the kitchen under the lights. Later, when it's time to put them out into the garden, I am going to cover them with fleece to protect them when it gets below 50 degrees, because I don't want them sending up flower heads. Good morning, and welcome back to Withrow Urban Homestead. Today, we're going to plant out onions. Onions like full sun. So we're going to plant them along this side of the garden. We get the best sun right here. Now, the onion roots are really shallow, so don't plant them real deep. You only want to plant those roots 1 inch deep. Let me show you on this hoary knife. Now, I potted up my onions, so they're in 4-inch pots. They've got a lot more soil than typically, so I went ahead and dug a trench to put them in. But if you grew your onions, bunched all together, and then you had to tease them apart, then you can use a dibber. I'll show you how later. Now, the measurement between your onions is going to depend on the variety. These first 13 are my red Italian flat cipollone. I think that's how you say it. They're only going to be about a 2-inch bulb, so I want to space them close together. We're going to put them about 2 inches apart. They're also going to be ready first. They're a faster growing variety. Now I also have some Spanish yellow sweet Utah onions, and I'm going to measure those about 3 inches apart. And we have some Walla Walla, and those are going to be spaced about 4 inches apart. So it's all going to depend on the size of the bulb. Now you can put them all really close together and then just harvest as green onions. Now, some already have some really well-developed root systems. The bigger the roots, the bigger and healthier the bulbs. That's the reason I wanted to pot them up. And I had enough space under the grow lights. I had plenty of soil. And I didn't really grow that many onions, only 70. If I was growing 300 onions, it wouldn't be possible to pot them all up. Let me show you some of the roots. Now you see the green hoops? I set these up so I can cover these with fleece because the nights coming up are going to be really cold. If onions are consistently exposed to temperatures about 45 degrees and below, they're going to send up a flower head. They're going to bolt, and I don't want that. So if the temperature dips below 50, I'm going to cover them up. So if onions flower, they're still edible. They're just not going to store well, not for several months. They'll rot. That's the reason I don't want them to send up a flower. Now we're going to start planting the Walla Walla. They're a sweet, bigger bulb. And we're going to measure them 4 inches apart. So you want to plant out your onion seedlings 4 to 6 weeks before your last frost. Here it's 6 weeks before our last frost. So it's mid-March. And we got a lot of cold days left. And again, that's the reason I've set out the hoops. Now the onions, the green leaves, the tops, they need this cool weather to grow. Now the trench is full, but I've still got one more Walla Walla left. So it's a perfect time to show you how to plant it if, you didn't pot them up, when you just have that little thin onion with the roots sticking down. Now those roots, they were too long for me to be able to use the dibber. But if your roots, are shorter than mine, you can try it with the dibber. It worked better for me to use the hori-hori knife. Now I said cold weather helps the tops grow. And that's important because the green tops become the solar energy collectors for growing the bulbs. The more stronger the leaves, the better. Now you'll read that onions are heavy feeders, and you want to feed them during the leaf stage. That's when they need to be fed. Now you see I've moved to the back half of the garden. And that side has enough because it gets less sun over there. So most of the onions are going to be here at the back of the garden. Now we're back to planting our red Italian flat onions 2 inches together. Now I don't plan to feed my onions because every fall I chop and drop all of my old plants and I cover everything with cardboard and then I mulch it again. That means for 11 years, I've been slowly building rich soil. There is a lot of organic matter in this garden. Plus, this area right here specifically for 4 years had quail on it. So it's got enough to feed all my plants this year. But if you want to feed your onions, there's 2 things I recommend. Put down a 1-inch layer of compost on the beds, or mix bone and blood meal, equal parts, like half a cup and half a cup. So 1 cup for 10 feet. And just dust that on top of your rows. Now, if you're feeding your onions, you want to stop when the bulbs start to form. You don't keep feeding them after that. At that point, you want them to focus on putting the energy down into the bulb. Now we're back to planting the Walla Walla, 4 inches apart. Now I haven't mentioned the row spacing. How far apart to plant it from your next row of plants. Now we got some strawberries here in the front, and they're going to bush out more. And I'm going to want 12 inches between the strawberries and the onions. That's going to give them room. And 12 inches is pretty much my minimum that I would give them. You can give them more space than that. Now, if cool weather helps the leaves to grow, what causes the bulbs to form? Well, that's dependent on the hours of daylight. Now remember, there's 3 kinds of onions. There's short day, intermediate day, and long day. And here I can grow the intermediate and the long day. The red are the intermediate, and the walla and the yellow Spanish are long day. Now, the short day only require 10 hours of light to start bulbing. The intermediate day take 12 to 14 hours of daylight to start bulbing. And the long day require 14 or more hours of daylight to bulb. So if you live in the South and you're growing long day onions, they're never going to bulb up for you. That's what makes the bulbs start to grow when they hit the right number of hours of daylight. Now, what are their water requirements? Onions do not like to dry out. Now, as onions mature, their water needs are going to increase. You need to water them even at the bulbing stage. Now, the Walla Walla are done, and we have the sweet yellow, sweet yellow Spanish Utah onions left. And we're going to space those 3 inches apart. Now you want to stop watering them when the tops start to fall over. Now, if you come back, you're not going to see me water because I do a no-dig method of gardening. Every fall, I lay down cardboard, and that holds in the moisture. I only water strawberries if they're suffering and our blueberry bushes, but I never water my onions. Now, I will water them today. I want to make sure the roots don't get stuck in any air pockets. And I will water them for about a week until they get established. But temperatures are really going to drop. I doubt I have to water much this week. It's going to be cloudy too. Onions also don't like weeds. They're the top vegetable crop that doesn't do well with weeds. But again, sheet mulching with cardboard helps. I don't have much weeds now because I dug that trench. Weeds are going to pop up in that area, and I'll just have to make sure to keep them pulled. Now, if you notice, I haven't trimmed the tops. I learned from no-till growers that the practice of trimming the tops and trimming the roots came from commercial growers. And the issue was the tops and the roots would get tangled. It had nothing to do with bulb size. Now, he used to trim his tops. He's a small farmer and he sells vegetables. But he studied the research and he found that it can actually impact and make smaller bulbs. I found that fascinating. Remember, the bigger the leaves, the bigger the bulbs. Now, if you slice an onion and you see the rings, one ring requires one leaf. Each layer of the onion requires one leaf. So the more leaves you have, the more rings you're going to have. Now tonight, I will close the fleece because it's going to get down to 37. But for now, if I leave it, the squirrels are going to dig. So I'm going to put some netting over it to protect it. And I'll come back tonight and cover it with the fleece. Good afternoon and welcome back to Withrow Urban Homestead. Today we're going to have an onion update. Now, I planted out these onions 5 weeks ago. The seeds were started indoors 12 weeks ago, and that made them 6 weeks old when I planted them out. And we have 4 jobs we need to do today. We need to remove any old cardboard pieces. We need to weed, add back the leaf mulch, and remove these low hoops. They're almost too tall for those. And we're going to replace it with tall hoops. Now in the fall, I chop and drop my old plants and I leave the mulch from that current growing year and I cover everything with cardboard. Then I put new mulch on top and it slowly breaks down. But this area had fall vegetables. So that cardboard was already punched through and had holes in it for those vegetables to grow. And now the spaces in between have dried out. And the skunk's been digging on the outside and pushing this cardboard up against the onions. Now that's better. The cardboard between the onions and the strawberries will leave. And like I said, that skunk kept trying to dig in and pushing this cardboard. Now we need to get the leaf mulch back on top. But first, I want to water. I want to make sure it's moist under those leaves because onions require a lot of water. They need 1 inch every 4 days. So far this spring, we've had good steady rain. and I haven't had to water. But the first week after transplanting, I did keep them watered every day until they got established. Aren't really that many weeds yet, and getting the mulch back on top will help. Now, if you notice, I did not trim my tops. The YouTube channel No Till Growers inspired me not to trim the tops. Because remember, the green leaves, the tops of your onions, those are your solar energy collectors for developing big bulbs. One leaf is responsible for one ring of the onion. Each layer requires a leaf. So the bigger, the healthier, and the more leaves you have, the better the bulb. I'll link their onion video in the description. I almost forgot I wanted to add some organic slug control because slugs love moist, dark spaces under the mulch. Onions are heavy nitrogen feeders. Now this area, I raised quail for 4 years, so it's already very rich soil. But if you've already planted your onions but didn't add any bone or blood meal, you can still do it. Just side dress your onions. Follow the instructions. Now in this cool weather is when the leaves develop. And it's the time to feed and water and keep your weeds pulled. But what causes the bulbs to develop? Well, that depends on daylight hours. And there's 3 varieties that require different amount of daylight. So the first of these onions are a red Italian flat onion called, let me look at my notes, hang on, make sure how to spell it. Cipollini. They require a minimum of 12 hours of light to start bulbing. At that time, stop feeding them because you don't want the leaves to keep growing. You want the bulb to develop, but you've got to continue watering. The more the onions grow, the closer to harvest, the more water they need. So those are my red Italian flat onions. Those are intermediate day onions. Now next to them are my Walla Walla onions, a big sweet onion. Those are long day onions and they require a minimum of 14 hours of daylight to start bulbing up. And last are my sweet yellow Spanish Utah onions. They're like the Walla Walla. They're a long day onion and they require 14 hours of daylight to start bulbing up. The more north you live in the U.S., the more summer sun you get. The farther south you live in the U.S., the less hours of summer daylight you get. So in the south, you have to grow short day onions. But here in north central Maryland, I can grow intermediate or long day onions. So make sure you pick which variety is best for your area if you want to grow large bulbs. Last, we're going to remove these green hoops because we're going to change them out for these tall hoops called super hoops. But I'm going to make a whole separate video about that, how to set it up. So why do I still need these? It's because skunks and the squirrels will dig in this area, and I need to leave netting on all season long. Let me show you last night what the skunk did, looking for grubs and nuts that squirrels had hidden. Now here's our other onion bed, and I've already set up the super hoops. Good afternoon and welcome back to Withrow Urban Homestead. Today we're going to set up our tall super hoops in the onion bed. Now I've already measured out my width of 40 inches because the compost pile is there. That limits how wide I can make it, but you can do the super hoops wider than 40 inches. I found spacing between the hoops, like over in this bed, is best at about 24 to 26 inches. Now 2 pieces make 1 hoop. Now, if you can look, there's a crossbar on these hoops. And you want that facing the inside because you don't want it snagging your row cover. See right there? Don't put that on the outside. Make sure it's on the inside. Now, the connectors are not going to be snug. They are going to be loose, and that's okay. Because they're tall, and when the wind blows with the cover on, they'll shake. So I felt like they needed more support. And this is what I use. Make sure the zip tie, the rough edges, are turned on the inside of the hoop so it doesn't rub against your row cover. It is that simple. Now let me show you another one. It doesn't have to be exact. eggplant's going to go right there. The netting's going to help protect it from flea beetles. Make sure any support you use that the tips are smooth. You don't want them tearing the row cover. I have a variety of sizes of these garden stakes, and I use them all the time. Now last night, this is the area where the skunk was really digging, because this cardboard wasn't fully covering the area since the fall vegetables were planted here. It already had holes in it, and it made it easy for the skunk to dig. Now, you have to buy the 10-foot wide row covers. It has to be 10 feet wide. I bought 100 feet of length, and then I'm going to cut it to size. Now, you want to fit it first before cutting, and I've learned don't gather it in the middle. Gather it at the corners. Just want to temporarily hold it in place with a landscape pen so you can do more adjusting. Now, my biggest challenge are the sides. They ride up, and you got to make sure you keep them pulled down as you tighten those corners. It's because this netting is so thin. If you use fleece that's thicker, it's really easy to cover these super hoops. You just gather it at the middle on the end and gather it at the middle on the other end. But this netting is so thin. Now, I was concerned the skunk's going to try to dig in over there, so I put lots of sandbags, much less than the other area of onions. Good morning and welcome back to Withrow Urban Homestead. Today it's June the 7th and it's time for an onion update. Now, these onions were the first veggie we planted back in mid-March. The cool, rainy spring has created beautiful, big, healthy green tops. Now that the sun's up at 5:30 and setting at 8:30, these long days are letting the leaves act as a solar energy collector to feed the bulbs. Normally, I don't water my onions, but because I'm creating this growing guide for you guys, I want to be able to give you the best information to get the biggest bulbs. So I bought a rain gauge. And I researched and I found a variety of answers, but I picked the advice that during the leafing stage, the onions need 1 inch of rain every 4 days. During the bulbing stage, like now, they need 2 inches of rain every 4 days. And when the bulbs are drying out, as the tops are falling over, they need 1.5 inches of rain every 4 days. Onions do require a lot of water, but you gotta be careful not to drown them because they can rot. So I'm going to add some links in the description with that information and how to figure out the amount of rain that's fallen, and then how much does that equal in gallons that you water. Now, yesterday we almost got 1 inch of rain. It's been a very wet spring. I think I've only had to water twice. Now, I love watching Cog Hill Farm, and he is always very successful in growing big onion bulbs. And his advice is to scoot the mulch in the soil from around the base of the plant. Don't let it cover the bulb and kind of blanch it out. So I've been doing that. Now remember, we planted 3 varieties. A red Italian flat called, I think, Cipollini. I think that's how you spell it. Those are right here. This direction. There's a few that got mixed in. Walla Walla and sweet Spanish Utah yellow. Sweet yellow Spanish Utah. The red will be ready this month because they're only going to grow about 2 to 3 inch wide bulbs. Very small onion. And the other two, the Walla Walla, it can be 6 inches. And the sweet Spanish is the same. It can be 6 inches, 3.5 to 6 inches. The Walla Walla, 4 to 6 inches. Those aren't going to be ready until next month in July. So we're going to wait until the top's yellow and brown and full overall on their own. And the neck will become, it'll die off. Then we'll harvest them. Now, I've Loving these super hoops. They've been protecting from digging animals since we planted these in mid-March, the whole growing season. Their height is just perfect. The onion tops have plenty of room to spread out. Let's go ahead and get this covered back and let it keep doing its job. Then we're going to go over to our second tunnel and look at those onions. Now these onions get less sun, so I don't expect these bulbs to get as big as the other ones. But we'll see. Now I'm not going to open this all the way, but I'm going to open the corner and harvest just a few for our Sunday family birthday celebration. I'm cooking fajitas. Good morning and welcome back to Withrow Urban Homestead. It's the beginning of August and it's time to harvest the onions. These are the long day varieties, Walla Walla and Sweet Spanish Yellow Utah. It's ideal to wait until the tops fall over on their own to harvest. There's less chance they're going to sprout in storage because it means they're finished growing. But today we're going to harvest them all because what's left over from Hurricane Debbie is bringing 4 inches of rain here to north central Maryland. The red onions were ready last month, and I already harvested those. Yesterday's video was me using those red onions to make a braid. These onions reached their full size for several reasons. I planted them in full sun. Onions prefer full sun. I gave them the recommended amount of space. I did not trim the tops from the time I sowed the seeds indoors. And I followed Dixondale Farms watering recommendations. I also gave them enough time and waited for the tops to fall over. Now let's bring these into the garage and lay them out to dry. Now if it was nice, hot and sunny weather, you could leave them out in the garden. But like I said, rain's on the way. Now, if you remember, near the house, we had another row of onions planted. And I harvested those last week. Let's get the rest of these pulled up. Now, if you feel any soft spots, go ahead and bring those in the house and either use them up or chop them and put them in the freezer. I only found 3. Some of these onions could have been harvested before now, but I was trying to wait and save them all for the video. I think this one's the biggest.